A 1970s baptism video revealed something in the river. 45. Years later, police finally watched it. It started with a soundless flicker. I was in the basement of St. Hildegard's Church, sitting cross-legged between two stacks of dusty VHS converters, a mug of half-warm gas station coffee balancing on a reel-to-reel player that hadn't been touched since before I was born. Outside, the Georgia humidity was pressing against the window panes like a breath held too long. Inside, the air smelled like vinegar film cleaner and mildew-soaked hymnals. I wasn't a filmmaker, not really, just a second-year archival assistant helping digitize old church records for a preservation grant. Sermons, youth retreats, wedding videos, potluck reels, hours and hours of forgotten analog memories. That morning, I pulled out an unmarked Super 8 canister from a box labeled Summer 78, Baptism. I thought it would be like the others. Gentle laughter, shaky footage, a preacher in white robes baptizing children in the river while parents watched from folding chairs, fanning themselves with church bulletins. But it was the silence that made me stop. The transfer was clean, no glitches, no warping, but the tape played like a dream. No audio, no title slate, just sun-bleached trees lining the banks of a slow river, and a group of churchgoers standing waist-deep in muddy water. The minister looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, his robe clinging to him like a second skin. Beside him stood a teenage boy, slender, pale, maybe 14, with a hand clasped nervously over his heart. A small congregation encircled them, heads bowed. I watched the footage all the way through once, then a second time. It was near the end that I noticed something I hadn't seen the first time. A flicker, almost imperceptible. Not in the people, in the water, just behind the boy's legs, beneath the ripples. The current seemed to break pattern, as if the river shifted against itself. I rewound a few seconds, slowed the playback. The minister dipped the boy backward, steady and practiced, a picture of reverence. But the water behind them stirred differently, like it folded inward, like something beneath the surface lunged forward and pulled. At first I thought it was just a distortion, a flaw in the film, but it wasn't. Frame by frame, I could see it more clearly. The boy flinched, not the theatrical gasp of someone surprised by cold water, but a true reaction. Sudden, instinctive. His shoulders jerked, his free hand twisted away from the minister's grip, fingertips scrambling toward the surface, his eyes snapped open wide. And then the current swallowed him. No one noticed. In the footage, the congregation kept praying. The minister adjusted his footing, continued the ritual. The boy didn't resurface. The scene cut abruptly. No fade, no zoom, just static, then black. I sat there for a long time, not blinking, not breathing. My fingers hovered over the pause key, my heart thudding in my ears like I'd run 10 blocks in July. I told myself it could have been anything. Light refraction, a shadow from a branch, a misstep in the water. But the fear in that boy's face was real. The panic in his eyes, the twist of his torso. He wasn't just losing balance. He was trying to escape, and no one noticed. I rewatched the final 30 seconds again, this time with the volume turned up, even though I knew there was no sound. I stared at the surface of the river, waiting. There it was, The distortion, the pull, the arm. It was quick, barely a flash. But the shape was there. Long, pale, human, a hand, reaching from below, dragging the boy under. I paused the frame at the moment the boy's head vanished beneath the surface. He was still looking upward, mouth open, hand out, frozen mid-movement. The minister's gaze remained forward, serene. I didn't realize my hand was shaking until I dropped the mouse. For a moment, I sat back and looked around the room. The other tapes, the flickering monitor, the silence pressing against the church walls like a held breath. What had I just seen? Had anyone else ever watched this closely? Why had this tape been sitting in a sealed box for 45 years? More importantly, who was that boy? There were no names written on the reel, no voiceover, no date slate. Just one label on the canister, Summer 78, Baptism. I clicked pause, reached for a notepad, underlined 2 words, find him because something had happened in that river. And that tape, long forgotten in the basement of a quiet little church, was the only witness that ever saw it happen. I started with the obvious, contacting the church office. St. Hildegard's didn't have a receptionist anymore, just a voicemail that offered 2 options. Press 1 for Sunday service times, or press 2 to leave a message. I pressed 0. It rang for nearly a minute before an older voice answered, quiet and cautious. "This is Deacon Frank." I explained who I was, the archive project, the video from 1978. I didn't mention the hand, not yet. I just said I was trying to identify the people in the baptism reel. There was a long pause. "You found that one?" he asked. My skin prickled. "Yes," I said. "There were 7 teens in the water. I was wondering if you remembered who they were." Another pause. I could hear his breathing over the line. "I remember the day," he said. "Hotter than it should have been. We baptized the youth group down at Crooked Bend. They wore white shirts over their clothes, to keep things proper. Reverend Colin was the one who led it. Do you have a list of the names?" "I can give you 6, he said. I waited. "And the 7th? I asked. His voice dropped an octave. "That'd be Evan Wilder." There was a weight to the name as he said it, like something pulled tight across decades finally giving way. I wrote it down. Evan Wilder. "What happened to him?" I asked, carefully. No answer. I waited. Then Deacon Frank said, "People say he left town. His folks packed up 3 weeks later, sold their house in a day, no goodbyes. Rumors said he ran off. Trouble at home, maybe. We all wanted to believe that." "And you?" I asked. He took a long breath. "I never saw him leave the water." That silence, that sentence, stretched between us like a thread soaked in gasoline. He didn't mean it metaphorically. He wasn't speaking in sorrow. He meant it literally. "No one thought to file a missing person report?" I asked. It was 1978. People didn't rush to the police over every shadow. His parents didn't speak of it. They wouldn't even answer questions from Reverend Colin. They just left. Everyone thought someone else had followed up. But they didn't. No. We never saw Evan again, and no one talked about it after. I asked if there were photos from that day, church bulletins, newsletters, anything that might show Evan's face more clearly. "I don't think so. That service ended strange. People scattered. I don't remember a group picture." I thanked him and hung up. Then I searched every physical file from the church's 1978 archives: bulletins, handwritten rosters, monthly updates. I found 6 names listed for the baptism: Michael R., Tamara G., Hope L., Julian C., brothers Wes and Eli Sanderson. All of them appeared again in later bulletins, singing in the choir or joining summer retreats. But the 7th name, Evan Wilder, vanished. No follow-ups. No youth night attendance. No school records. No obituary. Just a single name whispered across decades and buried under silence. Later that night, I froze the video on the frame where the boy's face is clearest. He stands knee-deep in river water, hands folded, looking up at Reverend Colin with nervous expectation. His hair is plastered to his forehead. His shirt clings to his ribs. He looks fragile, real, like any kid trying to be brave for the sake of ceremony. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. Just before the minister begins the blessing, Evan glances over his shoulder. For half a second, his eyes widen, not with awe or joy, with recognition, like he sees something, knows something, fears something. He turns back too quickly, swallows. I watched it over and over. He knew something wasn't right, and no one else saw it, not until now. I printed the frame and pinned it to my wall, wrote the name beside it in red ink. Evan Wilder, age 14, last seen August 5th, 1978. I stared at it for hours. Then I wrote one more word underneath. Disappeared. By the 3rd day, my apartment had turned into something between a war room and a shrine. Printouts of grainy still frames were taped across my bedroom wall. Evan's silhouette in the river, the instant before his head dipped beneath the waterline, the subtle disturbance just behind him that I couldn't unsee anymore. A red string might as well have run between the photos, connecting nothing, just looping endlessly around the unknown. I couldn't shake it. Not just the moment Evan vanished, but what came after. Or rather, what didn't. There was no panic, no cries, no search, no articles, just nothing. Like the town hit delete. I filed a public records request with the Dunsfield County Sheriff's Office, asking for any reports filed in August of 1978 for a missing juvenile. 2 days later, I got an envelope. Thin, too thin, just a single sheet of copy paper with a typed line. No report on record for Evan Wilder. No active or closed case under that name. I called the number on the letter, asked to speak to anyone who'd been on the force back then. They transferred me 3 times before a tired-sounding voice picked up. Clyde Jansen, retired. I help with archives sometimes. What's this about? I explained. The tape, the name, the absence. He didn't interrupt, but I could feel his grip tighten on the other end. Jesus, he said finally. They're still showing that tape? I told him no one had watched it until now. There was a pause. Then he said, "Yeah, I remember the day after that service. I was 24, just 6 months on the job. Got called by a churchgoer who thought she saw something strange in the river. Said she felt like one of the boys never came back up. Sounded crazy. There was no complaint filed, so the sheriff told me to go reassure the holy folks." He laughed, dry. But I went anyway. Took a walk down by the river. Saw footprints, 7 in, 6 back. Thought maybe the 7th was just faded. Current was strong that week. We figured it washed the print. But there was something else. What? A rock by the edge, smooth, flat, still wet, and on it, a smudge, like fingers, a handprint, small, too small for a grown man. I leaned forward, heart pounding. And you reported it? He exhaled. Typed it up, filed it. Sheriff never followed up. Said the kid's family left town, so there was no one to report him missing. That was enough for him to close the book. But you didn't. No, he said. I never could. It didn't sit right. Something pulled at that boy. I know it. But back then, when the church told you to drop it, you dropped it. I hung up the phone and sat in silence. A 14-year-old disappeared during a public baptism. No one filed a report. No one searched. His parents vanished 3 weeks later. And the only physical proof that anything had happened was a single tape no one dared rewatch. Until now. I returned to the church's archive room with a flashlight and gloves. The filing cabinets were old, metal rusted at the corners, but the labels were intact. I pulled drawer after drawer, sermons, choir records, building maintenance, and finally, one labeled Video Originals. In the very back was a heavy envelope marked 1978, Summer Service, Do Not Circulate. Inside was the original Super 8 reel, and behind it, something taped shut in yellowed masking tape, a handwritten report. Clyde's original field notes. August 6, 1978. Visited Crooked Bend. River churned. 7 sets of shoes found near water, only 6 returns accounted for in witness memory. Single partial handprint on flat stone. Juvenile size. Water too rapid for full search. Parents unresponsive to questioning. Unofficial conclusion. Assumed runaway. Recommend follow-up if family returns, but no one ever followed up because no one wanted to. Later that night, I froze the tape again at the moment Evan is fully submerged. I stared at the faces around him. The choir, the deacons, the smiling adults with clasped hands, all eyes closed. No one saw him go under, or they did, and chose not to say. I turned the volume up again, still no audio, but now the silence felt louder, and I started to realize something terrifying. Evan didn't just disappear into the river. He was forgotten into it. And maybe, just maybe, that was the plan all along. I stopped calling it a baptism video. Somewhere along the way, it became something else. A record, a riddle, a kind of quiet confession, flickering at 24 frames per second, that said more about silence than any sermon ever could. I spent the next 3 nights reprocessing the original film, using frame interpolation, motion mapping, contrast recovery, every trick I had access to. It was like trying to pull truth out of fog, but with each layer of static removed, the picture grew clearer. Not perfect, not sharp, but clearer. And then I saw it. Frame 532. That was the exact one. Just as the Reverend releases Evan's shoulders. Just as the boy starts to fall back. You see it, only if you're watching for it, only if you're willing to admit it's real. The water behind Evan parts, not in the way water should part, not like it's being disturbed from above or beside. It opens upward, like something is reaching. It's not a trick of the light. It's not film degradation. It's an arm, thin, pale, rising from the depths, fingers open, not flailing, but intentional. They curl toward Evan's shirt, grip it just below the rib cage. Evan's body jolts. His face changes in a heartbeat. What had been nervous focus becomes raw terror. His mouth opens not to say something but to scream. His left hand pushes off the Reverend's sleeve, trying to break contact, but the Reverend's eyes are closed, and Evan goes under. The rest of the video plays out like nothing happened. The Reverend turns, smiles toward the shoreline. The next teenager steps forward. There's laughter, clapping. Nothing to suggest that a child was just pulled from sight and never returned. I couldn't breathe when I saw it. I paused the frame and printed it. It came out grainy, ghosted with scanner noise, but the shape was undeniable. A hand, disembodied, reaching up from the river to grab a child during a sacred ritual. I stared at the image for nearly 20 minutes, not because I didn't believe it, but because I did. And now I had to ask a different question. What the hell pulled him? I didn't tell anyone right away. I couldn't. Not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because I was afraid they would. Instead, I found myself back in Deacon Frank's office 2 days later. The air inside the church smelled different now, like wet stone and old paper. He welcomed me with a slow nod, the way people greet you when they know you've seen something you weren't supposed to. I slid the photo across his desk. He didn't pick it up. He just stared. "This what you came to show me?" he said quietly. I nodded. He leaned back in his chair. "I was there, you know." "I know." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were faded Polaroids, rusted keys, yellowed bulletins. But beneath them, wrapped in wax paper, was a folded church program. August 5th, 1978. Youth Baptism, Crooked Bend. 7 names typed in faded ink, all crossed out with a pen, except one, Evan Wilder. "I kept it," Frank said, "not because I wanted to remember, but because I wanted to know if I had forgotten." I didn't understand. He looked up at me and his voice turned to gravel. Something changed after that day. People started hearing things. Voices in the river. The choir director drowned in his own bathtub 2 months later. We started canceling all outdoor services. Why didn't anyone ever talk about it? He swallowed. Because we weren't supposed to. And for the first time, he told me what he saw. He said he was on the shore that day, helping a boy with his hymn sheet. But when Evan went under, something twitched in the air. A coldness that rolled off the river like fog, and a moment later, one of the other teens turned to him and said, "Someone grabbed him." Not he slipped, not he dove. Someone grabbed him. Frank went to the Reverend, tried to tell him, but the man refused to listen. And that night, Evan's family vanished. He handed me a final item from the box. It was a VHS cassette, unlabeled, dusty. "I made a backup in '86, he said. "Never showed it to anyone. But now that you've seen it too." I left the church with the tape in my coat pocket. That night, I played it again. Frame 532, the hand, clearer now than ever. And beneath the surface, if you freeze just one frame later, you can see Evan's eyes, still open, still looking back. After that night, I stopped watching the footage on screens. I started seeing it everywhere. In the mirror, behind my reflection, a flicker of water. In the silence between subway cars, the faint gasp of breath held too long. I couldn't go near running water without scanning the surface for movement that didn't belong. The tape had become more than proof. It was an infection, a haunting with a timestamp. But the most disturbing part wasn't the image of the hand, or Evan's face, or even the fact that no one looked for him. It was this. I began to feel like I wasn't the first to uncover it. I returned to the church archive room, not out of duty, but obsession. I combed through every bulletin, every marginal note in the ledger books from 1978 through the mid-80s. And deep in a 1982 attendance ledger, someone had scribbled a name in pencil, not part of the printed roster. Evan. Nothing else, just the name, as if someone wanted to make sure it stayed, or maybe couldn't help but write it. Later that week, I spoke with the current pastor, Reverend Neil. Younger than I expected, calm, too calm. I saw the tape, I said. I've shown it to Deacon Frank. He gave me a copy he's kept since '86. Neil nodded, unfazed. We've always known about the tape, he said, but knowing and acknowledging aren't the same thing. So you knew, I said, tightening. I was warned, he replied, before I ever stepped behind that pulpit. Warned of what? That a child was pulled into the river and no one cared? He didn't flinch, but his tone dropped. That there's something in Crooked Bend that doesn't let go. I stared at him, waiting for the kind of laughter that tells you a story's gone too far. It never came. He leaned forward. Let me ask you something, he said. You've seen the footage dozens of times, right? I nodded. Have you ever counted the shadows? What? The shadows, he repeated, on the riverbank, in the congregation, the ones that don't belong to anyone standing there. I didn't answer, because I had noticed them. Slight distortions mostly, shapes that lagged half a second behind the people they were supposed to follow. A corner of darkness that shifted even when everyone else was still. He continued, every year, on the first Sunday of August, we have someone report a dream. It's always the same, a child, standing waist deep in river water, asking to come inside. I swallowed. Why haven't you done something? I asked. We pray, he said, and we remember. That's all we've got left. It wasn't enough. Not for Evan. That night, I couldn't sleep. The shadows in my apartment stretched longer than they should have. I played the VHS again, paused at frame 532, printed it a second time, pinned it next to the first copy on my wall. Evan, open-eyed, being pulled. And beneath that, just visible in the dark swirl of river water, a second face, faint, distorted, but there, a face looking up. I enhanced the image as far as I could before the pixels broke. The mouth was slightly open, the eyes sunken, wide, not alive, but aware, watching Evan, holding him. I couldn't tell if it was a child or something wearing the shape of one. And that's when the memory returned. Something Deacon Frank had said that I hadn't processed in full. We started canceling all outdoor services. Not because of weather, not because of convenience, because something watched them, and they knew it. So the next day, I did something no one had done in 45 years. I went back to Crooked Bend. The river was quieter than I expected, narrower. The trees arched over it like ribs over a lung. The water ran dark but not murky. And as I stepped to the bank, I realized how small the world must have felt to Evan, standing here, chest deep in what he thought was holy water. I knelt, and I listened. And beneath the wind and the current and the hum of cicadas, I heard it. The faintest splash, not upstream, below me. I didn't move for a long time. The splash could have been anything. Fish, a falling branch, the river breathing through its stones. But I knew better. There's a sound water makes when it moves with something, and there's a sound it makes when it moves because of something. This was the second kind. I stood, legs trembling, and stepped back from the edge. My shoes left wet outlines on the rocks, and I watched them darken, then fade, as if the river was trying to erase me the way it had erased Evan. The current at Crooked Bend had always been deceptively calm on the surface, but beneath, it was strong, circular, like memory or denial. It didn't sweep things away, it pulled them under. I didn't have a plan when I walked there. No camera, no recorder. Just that feeling in my gut that I was meant to come, not for answers, but for witness. Because Evan didn't just disappear, he was swallowed. And for 45 years, everyone let the silence finish the sentence. But I couldn't. I knelt again by the water and said his name aloud. Evan Wilder. The wind died. I said it again. Evan Wilder. And that was when I saw it. Not in the river, but beside it. A large, flat stone, maybe 3 feet across, buried beneath pine needles and moss. I brushed it clear with my sleeve. Beneath the grime, someone had carved letters. Crude, shallow, almost invisible unless you looked from the side. Evan, 1978. He never left. I touched the carving, and my skin went cold, like the stone had held winter inside it. My breath clouded, though the air was warm. For a second, I felt small again, like a child who'd wandered too far from the trail. Back at home, I took out the 2 frames I'd printed, frame 532 and the one after it, the one with the second face. I stared at them under a desk lamp for nearly an hour. It wasn't just Evan's death that haunted me. It was that no one ever watched closely enough to know he'd died. And maybe that's why the river still held his shadow. Because there'd been no one to call it what it was. A child lost. Not a runaway. Not forgotten. Stolen. The next day, I drove to the sheriff's office with everything I had. The enhanced footage, Clyde's original field report, the VHS tape from Deacon Frank, and a written affidavit detailing what I'd found. They opened an official, cold case investigation into the 1978 disappearance of Evan Wilder. The town paper printed the headline in small font, "Old footage prompts new search." But that didn't matter. What mattered is they sent a team to Crooked Bend. And after 3 days of ground-penetrating radar scans and sonar sweeps, they found something. Tangled in the roots of a submerged cypress tree, about 30 yards downstream from the baptism site, divers pulled up fragments of decayed cotton fabric, consistent with 1970s boys' uniform shirts. And inside a crevice at the base of the tree, wedged deep in rock and silt, they recovered something else. A leather-bound pocket Bible. On the inside cover, Evan Wilder. In handwriting barely legible from water damage, "I'm still here." The coroner couldn't find enough remains to confirm a cause of death, but the police listed it as probable drowning with suspicious circumstances. And for the first time in 45 years, Evan Wilder was listed as found. The church held a service the following Sunday. Not a sermon, but a reading. 7 names, 7 candles, and a final 8th one, left unlit, for the shadow, for whatever else had been in that river. Reverend Neal stood at the altar and said something I'll never forget. Some stories end not with a period, but with a witness. And sometimes, that's enough to break a silence. The tape was returned to the church archives, with one note added to its case in permanent marker. Do not erase. He deserves to be seen. I never watched it again after that, because I no longer had to. I already knew what was waiting in frame 532, and more importantly, I knew who.